Welcome to the Roost Podcast, where we peel back the layers to find out who the speaker is behind their name, credentials, and organization that they work at. I'm your host, Sean Pitcher. You can find me on Instagram at Sean_tactical RD. Today's guest we have on is Jonathan Levitt. He is the Senior Sales Executive for Tactical and Team Sports Branch at InsideTracker. He's also the first speaker that I brought on to talk more about biomarkers, labs, something that I've invested in a ton with my private practice, but also some of the organizations I've worked with in the past. I think at the end of the day, if you're not testing, you're guessing. And when it comes to high level tactical athletes or just athletes in general, we don't want to be in a position where we're guessing, especially if they have labs that are low, deficient, abnormal, or putting them in a position where their labs could be at a more optimal level to help them perform better. But John, thank you for coming on today.
Of course, that's a pretty good explanation of what we do and why we do it. So love it.
Well, we'll dig into it a little bit more when we get to that. But first question I start with every guest. Could you please just give us an idea of who is John? What is your roots?
Yeah, so I started asking this question on my podcast because I didn't really like doing intros for people. And what ended up coming from it is people tell you what they care about, and it's a pretty cool way to drive the conversation. So maybe that's why you do it too. I don't know. But the way I answered that question, so I love the question, even if it's not intended to be as insightful as that, or even if it is. Anyway, the way I answer the question, I grew up in Boston or outside of Boston. I spent 7 or 8 years living in Boston. Grew up, fairly standard New Englander, playing baseball and hockey and hating endurance sports and this kind of stuff. And as the years went on, I fell off the deep end into running and trail running and cycling and all these things. And today I find myself, or at least my furniture, living in Boulder, Colorado. And yeah, work for InsideTracker. I've been there 10 years. Been pretty cool to see the growth of the interest in that space. And then I host my own podcast. I've been doing that for the last 5 years. So I know how much work goes into doing this and can appreciate that for sure. And yeah, just a curious person who likes to learn from people that are smarter than me.
Yeah, and to go up what you said initially there, I just like to get someone's authentic, real view of themselves. I think a lot of times, we go to conferences, we hear some of these podcasts, you just get that Rolodex of I've been to these 30 different places and
Right.
like, that's awesome and
Bunch
that's
of
cool.
logos. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's superficial to a certain extent, but like at the end of the day, like let's get down to know who you are, because I think that's what people really want at the end of the day.
For
Um,
sure.
and out of Boston, you were in a fantastic, obviously, sports town growing up. I guess you got very lucky for that standpoint with the Celtics, Bruins, and Patriots.
Yeah, I was actually just having a discussion about this with an old guy who was a little bit older than me, but had Steelers logos in his background in footballs and whatnot. And I was like, "Oh, you're a Steelers fan?" And he has been a fan since the '70s. And he asked about me, and I was like, "Yeah, I was born in '90, and the Boston domination began in 2001, and continued for 20 years." So it was a
You
pretty
were born and hit at the right time.
I got lucky. Yeah.
And I'm a Patriots fan myself. I get a lot of scrap from home because most of my family is Giants fans. So I really can't bring anything up because we got beat those two times by the Giants. So it really doesn't matter what I say. They bring up those two Super Bowls and like that's like end of story.
Yeah, I met Kevin Boss out in Bend, Oregon a few years ago, and it took everything I had in me to not say something about that stupid catch.
Yes. That'll sink in our hearts for a long time.
Oh yeah.
But Inside Tracker, you've been there 10 years. Could you give us a little bit kind of the origin story, I guess, behind it? How did it
Yeah.
start? Why did it start? Kind of what is your goal behind what you guys do?
Yeah, so Dr. Gil Blander is the founder. He had a death in the family when he was very young, and he said, "I want to live forever." And he was about 9 at the time, and he's 165 now, so he's doing quite well. Just kidding. Anyway, he decided he wanted to dedicate his life to the anti-aging process and found himself in some of the top labs in the world. in Boston, notably at MIT, and surrounded by Harvard and Tufts as well, some of the best on the nutrition and aging side of things. And so he was like, well, I could remain a scientist and publish a bunch of papers that other scientists will see and, have an impact on the science community. That would be cool. Or I could start a company and drive change for every human on the planet. And so when I joined in 2014, I asked him, what is the goal of the company? And he said, to touch the life of every human on the planet. And as time has gone on, I've realized that that's not hyperbole. He legitimately means and believes that that's going to happen and is possible. And as time has gone on, I am realizing it's possible as well, whether directly or indirectly. So 2009, he begins InsideTracker. It was called Segterra at the time, which means of the earth. Um, and 2013, it launches commercially. I joined in 2014 as the first business hire outside of the CEO. And um, it was really early for something like this, right? The dietitian that was working for InsideTracker at the time, her name was Tara Mardigan. Her name is still Tara Mardigan. But she was also the dietitian for the Red Sox. Um, and so we got our start in 2013 with the chicken and beer Red Sox team. And it's all uphill from there. Um, and so, like I said, it was really early, and the first, really 5 years, 4 or 5 years, maybe 3 years, were spent convincing people that this is something that they should even think about, right? Um, there are some higher end performance coaches who have been doing biomarkers for 20 years. But that's the norm now, at least in the little echo chamber that I live in. Um, and as time went on, it started to be normalized to think this way, to think that if you want to perform better, you need to know what your insides look like. And I mean that from a biochemical standpoint. And then the pandemic happens, and then people are punched in the face with this like health invader, that there's plenty of data to suggest that if you are healthier at baseline, you have less of a risk of all these problems occurring statistically. And so this really changed things for us. And people started thinking about health in ways that they never had before. And then you have health and science communicators with popular podcasts and millions of listeners, and a truly seismic shift occurred in the space in really 2021, 2022. And we were, off like a rocket ship as a result of this thing that we had no control over. Um, and so while it was a horrible thing for a lot of people, it created this ripple effect, or it created this potential for change that has never existed before. Before we started recording, I was speaking with a state representative who wants to bring uh, actual healthcare to his state. And so we have a presentation to discuss how to bring a program like InsideTracker in a pilot study of 1,000 people to see if we can reduce healthcare expenditures and like actually introduce healthcare, not just sick care. And the state spends over $1 billion on diabetes. Well, what if we could reverse that? What if we could prevent that? What if there were things that could be done that delay the need to spend thousands of dollars on Ozempic or on diabetes medicine or all these things? And so
It's like a
so
similar
many
approach
people.
with the tactical space, like they're finally bringing in practitioners on the front end in these undergraduate courses where, our military personnel are just starting and just coming into, which is, if you look at it, provides a lot of rate of return or savings at the end of the day,
Right.
because now you got people coming out 40, 50, 60 years old. Hopefully now they have all these different skill sets and behaviors in place that's allowing them to have a healthier life, or at least have the tools to be able to manage it, versus how it used to be done. You get out 40, 50, you're broken, you go to the VA, but then you don't know what else to do. Like you just don't have the skills to be able to figure
Exactly.
out how to keep yourself healthy for a longer period of time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we're doing a lot in the space. With a lot of veteran groups. So Team RWB is a group that we've been aligned with for a while, and they're doing a study with 75 veterans. What happens if you introduce InsideTracker plus community engagement and accountability? And like, will those people improve faster than the general population or faster than a control set? Um, Virginia High Performance is a group that many of your listeners may be familiar with, or at least Navy SEAL Foundation sponsors the ability for these veterans to go through an offboarding program where they are working with a strength coach and a dietitian um, as part of their reintroduction into civilian life. And so part of that includes biomarkers. And they're doing some advanced screening, like some of the heavy metals and advanced thyroid tests, because these guys need to know what those levels are and whether it
Yeah,
was exposure related or whatnot.
some of the chemical stressors these guys are getting exposed to. I mean, the general population just doesn't understand
Right,
and get,
right,
unfortunately. But when you get immersed in that space and you end up finding out the clothes, the water, the air, you're in certain areas of different parts of the world or the country where you can get exposed to stuff that you might not get exposed to here in the United States. And, you know, I love when I hear the thing over and over and over, like, oh, well, it's not bad for you because you're only getting exposed to a little bit. Okay, well, imagine
but a
getting
little bit over
exposed to that
time.
little bit of lead or whatever the metal or whatever it is for 20 years,
Right,
microdosing that over time. Well, guess what? That's going to accumulate and that can cause some downstream and some long-term issues. So to play it off as like, it's not going to be a big deal. Well, in the grand scheme of things, like, yes, it could be.
right. Totally. Yeah. And so to that point, the fire service is another example where you want to avoid extreme heat, so you wear materials that enable you to avoid extreme heat. And you practice in those materials that enable you to avoid extreme heat, and then you leave them on. Well, now it's come out that maybe you shouldn't leave them on, and you should only wear them when absolutely necessary. But we're working in that space because heart disease is such an extreme challenge that is faced, and cancer as well. And so, like I said, we grew up in the endurance and pro sports space, and it's nice to, help marathoners run a little bit faster, but it feels a little bit different to be supporting firefighters or police officers or military members or veterans um, in bettering their health. And you look at the connection between physical health and mental health, right?
Mhm.
So if your physical health is poor, you're more likely to have poor mental health. But if your physical health is improving, there's some association to improved mental health. And so some of the metrics like vitamin D or cortisol are directly tied to the ability to feel good or not be stressed or things like that. And it's been pretty cool to hear some of the results that and the way that this data is being used to drive decision making. So an example of this is, look at a firehouse. In a firehouse, there's this all call system and it rings in every room. Well, what if it didn't need to ring in every room? And what if the guys who are coming back from a call at 6:30 in the morning are able to sleep past 7 when the system starts ringing? Well, that's going to influence cortisol levels, testosterone levels, all these things that are influenced by sleep quality and sleep duration. So, what if we can provide an evidence-based change or proof of benefit of a change from something that has existed the way that it has existed simply because that's the way that it has existed? Those are the conversations, those are the experiments and initiatives that we're looking to develop and support and create some systematic and behavioral change that's going to have a substantial impact on health and longevity and the ability to like do the job and stay in the job and not have it kill you.
And that's one of the big challenges too, not only the health perspective, but these firefighters, police officers, tactical, they're just in a sympathetic state all the time. like, and they just don't have the ability or know how to like turn it off and get
Right.
parasympathetic, or their schedule and
Right.
routine or environment is just so chaotic. They don't know how to make those adjustments. And like you said,
Right.
like they're just going to have a direct impact on your biomarkers, your health. And again, if you're chronically exposed to that type of environment over and over for years, like it's going to add up and it's going to end up catching up with you if you don't try to do something about it.
For sure.
Do you find more people, obviously more people are trending towards really investing and caring about their health? One of the challenges I find with like clients or individuals I work with is like they'll go to their physician, they'll get labs with them, but there may be stuff that I recommend that I want to get done. Maybe certain micronutrients, certain hormone labs, that obviously insurance doesn't cover them, right? Or maybe the doctor's like, okay, we'll get them done, but they'll charge you double, triple the cost.
Right.
So are you finding that out in your specific space, or more companies that are providing this opportunity to get biomarker tests done outside of the typical healthcare system provides them a better, unique option and getting the results quicker and finding out stuff faster versus maybe that other, typical option they might have to go through?
Yeah, it makes it possible, first of all, and then it makes it meaningful, second of all. So you get your numbers back and you're an expert and you know what they mean, right? I've learned enough to know what they mean, but for the majority of people, they don't know what a 28 vitamin D level is. They don't know what a 650 testosterone level is. Is that good? Is that bad?
Yep.
And all you have are these general normal ranges that are the same for 95% of the population. If you're a tactical athlete, if you're a military member, if you're a couch potato, you have the same normal range. That's pretty messed up. I don't think that those people are the same
I
and
agree.
their needs are quite different, right? So, not only do we enable the ability to execute more than just glucose and cholesterol and triglycerides, which is what insurance is willing to pay for because it costs them $5.
Mhm.
Um, we add meaning to the metrics, right? If you just have a bunch of numbers and you can test everything under the sun, like some of these other lab providers offer, 100 biomarkers for $500, totally meaningless if you don't have the insight into what to do with the information.
Exactly.
And so we create this app, we create the action plan that enables an individual to actually apply these interventions. And then when working with a practitioner, it enables a better conversation with a dietitian or strength coach or someone. Um, and then in a group setting, there's the ability to compete on it. So we work in pro sports, and Lisa McDowell with the Detroit Red Wings has gotten to a point where her athletes are competing on vitamin D levels and a metric that we have called inner age, and they call it the Labby Awards. And it's just like something fun that Lisa has been able to. It's a culture thing that she's been able to create, and she's been able to see improvements in the data, improvements in these values, and the athletes feel empowered and not they don't feel like it's predatory that the organization is testing them 2 or 3 times a year and getting their testosterone levels. They
And I think
they
that's the
are happy
biggest
about it.
That's the biggest point right there. If you can bridge that gap between the owner, the higher ups, and showing like this is going to provide value, but we're also going to not use this data against you
Right.
guys. We're using to try to help you and I'll try to optimize your performance. I think that's a huge gray area or barrier that a lot of practitioners face and athletes are then scared of because they're like, especially nowadays, social media, people will try to find anything to use something against you to put you down a notch, get rid of you, put you in a position that you're not able to make the choices that you want to make. And when you have that cohesiveness as
Right.
a group, it definitely makes those conversations a lot better to foster the environment that you want.
Definitely. And then on the other side of the equation, we work with a bunch of sports agents. And I was at the winter meetings in Nashville this past December, and agents are looking to provide this to their athletes so that they can negotiate.
Yep.
And let's say you have an athlete that is 35 years old and doesn't look like a 35-year-old internally, and their testosterone is 800 and their vitamin D has been optimized for the last 5 years. Um, and they feel good. that athlete is worth more than, a 35-year-old athlete who has a testosterone level of 400 consistently, and has been injured for the last number of years. And so it's it's an interesting, like, everyone is empowered to, or motivated to have the data and to drive changes on it. But then you think about, so that's interesting from the pro sports side, right? Where you want to do it for a contract or you want to do it to perform better. But in a setting like fire or military, you're only as good as the most tired or weakest person in your unit, right? I've never participated in this, but I have to imagine that that's the case, right? So you really want all these people around you to be optimal all the time, or as much as possible. So I have to think that the culture of excellence exists where, like, you want the guy next to you to be perfect and in a good place, versus you're not competing for a contract with this guy.
Yeah, the best way I was explained to me when I first got into the tactical space is like it's life or death. It ain't you're
Right.
missing your free throw and you get another free throw. If you mess up, if you're tired, if you're exhausted, if you're in a position where you can't stay at the level that you need to perform downrange, right? Either that's going to directly impact you, or now it's going to directly impact your team. And now the mission's, impaired, or now multiple people are getting in a position where they can get killed. And at the end of the day, like that's obviously the last thing we want to happen for anybody.
Right.
But a lot of times it comes down to these little minute details like this that if they were approached and talked about and thought about and did ahead of time proactively versus reactively when the worst case scenario happens, like you're saying, kind of time and time again, we'd be in a lot better situations. And I
For
like
sure.
what you said about, the piece of the as a dietitian or practitioner, having that piece of data with the biomarkers gives us another reason to have a seat at the table with those higher level individuals.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, everything is going to come down to resources, money, and contracts.
Right.
And like you said, if someone they're going to sign for you know, 10 to 30 million dollar deal for 2 to 4 years, and we find out they're really not taking care of themselves and they're kind of just on that fringe living off their talent, well, why am I going to want to invest in the next 4 to 6 years for this person and all this money if I know they're not investing in themselves to be the best that they can?
For sure.
And when you speak those type of words to the higher ups,
Yeah,
that obviously means way more than maybe some other verbiage or discussions you might have with them about other stuff.
for sure.
One of the other things you mentioned too was we have these baseline average levels. And this is something I've always wondered about and have discussion with other practitioners is how do you guys differentiate what level should be for a tactical athlete or an athlete in general when we know their fueling needs are higher, their stress levels are higher? Like, do you guys change your ranges for those higher performing individuals, or have you essentially collected enough data to see where more optimal ranges are based on certain positions, players, or tactical performers?
Yeah, so it's going to be dependent on a handful of variables. So age, weight, height, gender, ethnicity, and activity type and duration. I'd love to say that, a safety and a quarterback have different optimal zones, but there isn't really enough literature to suggest that that's the case. However, a white person and an Asian person have different HSCRP ranges because the magnitude of impact for an Asian is different than a Caucasian. And so it's reflected in that way. Runners have different needs than people who aren't introducing 15,000 foot strikes on a daily basis on pavement. So the Ferritin needs are different. For example, if you are doing 5 hours a week versus 15 hours a week, the needs are different. Um, so yeah, it's super dependent. The story I love the most is that paints this picture is a friend of mine signed up for InsideTracker when she was injured. She was, I don't know, 28-year-old runner at the time. And So she filled out her profile and her ferritin was optimal. Fast forward a few months and she was running again and she changed her profile. And then all of a sudden she was like, hey, wait, my ferritin is no longer optimal. I didn't do another blood test. How do you know? And her range had shrunk because she logged that she was doing, I don't know, 6 hours of running in that week or 8 hours of running a week. And I was like, now you understand. You are the same person. You just changed your activity level and activity type, and your needs are different. And it was the perfect illustration of how and why do we do what we do from this personalized approach.
Yeah, it's the same thing with fuel. Like fueling constantly changes. You get these athletes that like, oh, I need to eat chicken, broccoli, rice for the next year, the same calories,
Right.
the same portion size, the same amount. But I'm like, well, you need to get outside the blinders and think about big picture. What's going on in your preseason, your off season, your in season? What's going on in the summer? What part of your years where you're stressed more than others? Is the during the year worse than obviously in the off season? As your fueling demands higher, and just there's just so many questions you got to ask and really be able to dig into with some of these individuals. And that's kind of one of the big reasons why I use the word roots, because I think a lot of times, right, if you're a practitioner, you should really be asking the questions to figure out why things are originally happening in the first place.
Right.
Sometimes we're just fast paced. We want to move through clients, we want to move through athletes, or we don't have a lot of time. But that little extra time you will take will give you so much more information to provide
Right.
better suggestions and recommendations and guidance on what are the next steps that they actually need to be taking versus getting that very surface level idea, you're missing something. And now we could have made a lot more impact than we currently are.
For sure.
If I'm a practitioner, for example, say a dietitian, what are maybe my best bang for my buck labs that I could get on an athlete or a tactical performance individual. Obviously, some companies, places may have the finances to be able to do it. Like if you look at a special forces or a professional level team, but you may have some private practice individuals. You may have some smaller schools, high school kids. People that are interested in getting it, but they're like, I don't know if I can do the whole entire lab. What are kind of my top ones I could say like if I get these will definitely make a difference if I can figure out how we can adapt and figure out how to get these into a better range.
Yeah, I mean, vitamin D and ferritin are the two obvious ones, particularly for any endurance-based athlete with the ferritin or female athletes. Um, Beyond that, testosterone for guys, DHEAS for women. It's a good proxy for energy balance, particularly when you also look at LDL, which is a cheap marker to look at to understand like caloric intake. Are these people taking in enough? If DHEAS is low, it may be suggestive that they could eat more. They could eat more. And then if LDL is high, it could be an indicator of like the type of macro that might be beneficial or more whole grains or whatnot. Um, Beyond that, ApoB is one that's grown in popularity over the last couple of years, thanks to Peter Attia. ApoB is a more reliable indicator of heart health and future disease state. It's pretty easy to, or it's pretty, you can impact it, and it's useful. So it's less athletic performance and more general health. Um, but yeah, vitamin D and ferritin are two. Ferritin is really inexpensive. Vitamin D is not, which is why your physician's probably not willing to order it. It could cost $200 through insurance or $300 through insurance, which is
Yeah.
ridiculous because that's nowhere near what the what the lab actually charge, or at least what the lab charges us.
Yeah.
Um, so the markup on that one is pretty dramatic because people know what it is and they want it. So it's been commoditized. But for me, it's really like the group of markers to understand. And so what we've done at InsideTracker is we've created these category tests. So you do a comprehensive baseline, which looks at metrics that are relevant to energy and metabolism, sleep and bone and muscle health and all these things, and covers up to 50 metrics. And then you focus the retesting on what you care about. So heart health, sleep, energy, whatever it is. those 10 values at a much lower price point. And so the best practice has sort of become, do this comprehensive baseline to get a full assessment of where you're at, and then follow up as needed based on either what the test identifies as needing improvement in, or what you care most about. But again, to more directly answer the question, um, there was an NHL team that I spoke with that looked at six, I think it was like six metrics, and it was vitamin D, ferritin, testosterone, um, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides, or it was something pretty basic like that. They didn't even look at testosterone. Um, and that test is pretty inexpensive. If you're just doing those 5 or 6 values, the lipid panel is really inexpensive, but you can get that through insurance, so it's not, terribly exciting. Um, but yeah, it's more about I think it's more about the frequency versus just doing one large panel once a year. And to understand, like, you should pay attention to a couple of things and focus on that versus trying to address everything.
So how frequent would you recommend? I've always typically said like every 3 to 4 once, maybe let's say minimal twice a year. If you can get up to 4 times a year, that would be ideal. Is that similar to what
Yeah,
you
exactly.
typically recommend?
Yeah, and so as you can imagine, we have a lot of higher end customers, whether they're professional athletes or executives or whatnot. And so I like to look at best practice as, if money's not an object, what do those people do when they're looking for max efficiency and best results? And nobody's doing more than quarterly for the most part.
Gotcha. So you mentioned having a dietitian on staff. Is that something where your dietitian goes out to educate and teach practitioners about biomarkers, or you're having people that are getting labs done and there's some education portions behind that that the clients or individuals you're working with can reach out to that practitioner or the practitioners you have? Like, how does that end work?
Yeah, so the app itself is designed to educate, and so we provide that education for the individual biomarkers. We provide that for the groups of biomarkers. So the iron group, the heart health group, what does this all mean congruently? And then on the practitioner side, we have a program called InsideTracker Pro that's designed for coaches and trainers and dietitians that is includes more education. So we do, like, every couple of months we do a webinar. Sometimes every month we do a webinar with experts in the space. So we've had Stacy Sims, we've had people like that on to talk about a topic that they're an expert in. And that's like basically continuing education that's available for that group of practitioners. And then we have 2 levels of courses. The first one is like an intro to InsideTracker and how to use the tool with your clients. And then the second one is more of an education on biomarkers and what all this means, um, because most people aren't taught biochemistry, whether you're a dietitian or not, it seems.
Mhm.
Um, and so we like to provide that education. And so it's intended for people not to, have a master's in it and be able to pass tests at the end of it, but to have a speaking and working knowledge of what all of this means so that you can communicate and use the tool again as leverage and the expert and enable better conversations with the clients while knowing what you're talking about.
Yeah, because it's great to know all the information or have that knowledge, but if there's no applicability to it, or you're not able to transcribe that into a form where the individual can understand that, you're
Right.
going to lose a lot of people really quickly.
Right.
You're going to
For
have a
sure.
hard time being able to essentially win them over to get them to continue to keep doing that or fighting for
For
them to do
sure.
that. Do you guys do any supplementation in conjunction with your guys' services? Obviously, we know, most dietitians are gonna, do a food first approach. But as we get into some of these higher level athletes, we know that, even through intaking the amount of food that someone have to intake, there's probably going to be situations where they may not get, let's say, certain micronutrients like a zinc, a vitamin D, and omega-3 at the levels of the amount that they need to. So do you guys do anything in that realm as well?
Yes, so we make recommendations for supplementation when needed. And we make branded recommendations that's been aggregated from our dietitians based on quality of those supplements. So there's no bias in there because it's pulling from the top two or three brands from Labdoor for each micronutrient or supplement. And so it says our dietitian recommends this. Here's when to take it. So with iron, for example, many people don't know that you don't want to take it with food or after exercise or whatnot. And so we say empty stomach or with food or with a meal or before bed or something like that, to give some guidance on timing because it's so critical for so many of these supplements.
And one of the final things I want to ask you, you mentioned testosterone a couple of times earlier. Are you guys seeing on your end with contact athletes, tactical athletes that are in downrange, having chronically low testosterone when they get out of their sport or even during their sport? And is that affected from thyroid disruption? So it's having a downstream effect? Any insight there? That's just a common trend I'm kind of picking up and starting to see. Would love to hear any feedback you have on that.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull up some data pretty quickly on that. What we generally see is that level is depressed during the season. And so we look at the testosterone to cortisol ratio, and then um, players with a low testosterone to cortisol ratio, then we look at the CK status, so creatine kinase, or we look at the cortisol status or CRP status, or HSCRP, to understand if there's some sort of thyroid challenge or whether it's a training challenge. But the reality of it is these guys are, at least in team sports, they're on the road for so long and their circadian rhythm is thrown off and they don't have control over their sleep schedule and they compete and they take in caffeine and then they are supposed to sleep and you're on this like high of having 20,000 people or 40,000 people cheering for you
Yeah.
and then it's silent and you're on a plane and you're supposed to sleep. So how do you maximize that? So one team that's doing things well on the sleep side is the Edmonton Oilers, and the work that they're doing with Chad Drummond and Joel Jackson and their chef Mikhail. Um, they're doing pretty well this season. I think they were second in their division, and they're strongly onto the playoffs. And sleep is a focus for them, and so their data has improved over the season in that regard because they know what they need to work on and they know how they need to work on it. Um, on the tactical side, it's a little bit harder because, yeah, the circadian rhythm disruption and the stress is a stress in a different way. I mean, with fire, you could sleep through the night or you could have five calls, and it ends up being getting more out of the time that you are able to sleep versus changing your alarm clock. That's really not an option. So to answer your question, yes, we do see that. We see it as something that needs to be focused on. And so part of the reason that people do this comprehensive panel versus like just looking at testosterone is because there are supporting metrics that if they're low, you're playing from behind the eight ball, right? If your magnesium level is low or if your vitamin D level is low, it's going to impact your ability to produce testosterone and have healthy levels of testosterone. So we don't want people, out there optimizing all sorts of things while like they could put a vitamin D pill in their mouth for 10 cents a day and influence things for the better. Like you need to know those complementary metrics